To be a commander during wartime requires certain skills and attributes, as you may imagine, and one of those must, of necessity, be a belief in your own abilities and a belief that your forces can accomplish their tasks, especially on the battlefield. But what happens when that belief is at odds with reality? When your belief in your abilities becomes overinflated and ignores the basic facts of war? You'll see this week. I'm Andy Nidell. This is The Great War. Last week, we saw the German army finally reinforce the desperate Austrians and hold off the Russians in the Carpathian Mountains. The Russians were victorious, though, in Armenia. The French gained some ground. Italy raised its voice, and the South Africans were on the move. Here's what followed. On the Western Front, this was a week of aerial bombardment. Ostend was bombed by 15 Allied planes on the 15th. The same day, a French airship bombed Freiburg and the next day Strasbourg. And on the opposing side, there was a Zeppelin raid on East Anglia and a German airplane bombed Faversham and Sittingbourne. But the men in the trenches were going nowhere. Actually, in the east, it seemed to be the same story for once. There was heavy fighting throughout the week as the Russians repeatedly tried and failed to take the Usok Pass in the Carpathian Mountains. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, it looked like the Russians were going to smash the Austro-Hungarian army, break through the mountains, and overrun the Hungarian plains below. But at the 11th hour, the Austrians had been reinforced by the newly formed German Beskiden Corps, troops specially trained to fight in the snowy mountains, and the Russian breakthrough had been prevented, at least for the moment. But even though the Russians couldn't take the pass, they still made progress elsewhere this week in the mountains southwest of the Rostoki Pass, and were still threatening as the week ended. The Austro-Hungarian Imperial Army was now playing defense, but for nearly 3 months it had mounted offensive after offensive against the Russians high in the frozen mountains. These offensives were the brainchild of Army Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf, but were so incredibly badly conceived that they brought the entire Imperial Army to the brink of destruction. The Austrians had neither the men, the equipment, the training, nor the strategy to maintain even a single offensive against Russian mountain troops from Siberia, let alone 3. The biggest objective of those offensives had been to free the trapped Austrian garrison at the fortress of Przemysl, a symbol of Habsburg military might. But Conrad's troops never stood a chance of achieving this. The fortress had surrendered to the Russians nearly a month ago, over 120,000 prisoners of war, but the Austrian army had taken over 800,000 casualties in its attempts to break them out. And if you can somehow justify that, then tell me how, because I can't. I think the real lasting tragedy from Conrad's machinations was the mental and physical trauma caused on both sides by what was the first example of total warfare fought in mountains. This was in many ways the Stalingrad of World War I. But people weren't just being killed by the enemies. We had a situation where, I'm not kidding, upwards of 100,000 people froze to death in the mountains. The White Death. I've talked a lot about it over the past few months, but Conrad's complete obliviousness to the realities of the offensives was staggering, and it had a price, other than the loss of most of his troops. On April 13th, Conrad agreed to put his Austro-Hungarian 3rd and 4th armies under the direct command of German Army Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn. He couldn't really do worse than Conrad, and the timing was appropriate in other ways too, for the Russian counteroffensive was now developing some of the many logistical problems that had befallen Austria. When they were in the lower mountains, they had had shorter supply routes and fairly good railroad connections, but as they pushed the Austrians back, they began to deploy troops in inhospitable terrain, regions that seriously limited mobility and overextended supply lines. It might have been a blow to Conrad's prestige to give up direct command of his troops, but it did free him up to deal with other matters, such as the Italian question. Last week, Italy had responded to Austrian offers of territory in exchange for Italian neutrality with a huge list of other territorial acquisitions and demands that Austria would have to agree to preserve that neutrality. This week, the court at Vienna declared those proposals unacceptable. Italy then turned from the Central Powers and began offering terms to the Entente, who agreed to negotiate. Now, Italy had 800,000 men in its army, and if it joined the war, it could send them against Austria in yet another front. What would Conrad do in that case? Well, new fronts were still springing into being, and the war was still growing larger and larger in scale. It was fairly obvious to all by now that there would soon be a new front at the Dardanelles, the gateway to the Black Sea. The Turks were building their defenses like crazy as the Allied forces gathered in Egypt and the Aegean Islands. Now, an easy victory at Gallipoli was seen by most of the Allied command as a foregone conclusion. But on April 12th, there was one warning note by Maurice Hankey on the British War Council, who wrote to Prime Minister Asquith that the military landings on Gallipoli were entirely based upon, quote, the supposed shortage of shells and inferior fighting qualities of the Turkish armies, end quote. The Ottoman forces had, it's true, suffered defeat after defeat, and actually, this same week there was a sort of confirmation of the prevailing attitude as Ottoman forces attacked the British in Mesopotamia. The Battle of Shaiba was a series of engagements fought between April 11th and April 14th, when Turkish and Arab forces descended on Basra. There were preliminary bombardments on Korna and Shaiba the 11th, but the main thrust of the attack was to outflank the British on the 13th across the floods that separate Basra from Shaiba. This was unsuccessful, even though the attackers had the advantage in numbers, but they were routed the 14th, suffering heavy losses. Now, General Sir John Nixon had become Commander-in-Chief of British forces in Mesopotamia a few weeks before this attack, and he was charged by his superior, General Sir Beauchamp Duff, Indian Army Commander-in-Chief, with not only securing Basra and the British oil fields, but also of mounting a forward defense, which basically meant organizing a campaign toward Baghdad. London had no knowledge of this plan, and actually had specifically said no advance beyond Basra would be sanctioned. So one hand really didn't know what the other hand was getting up to, and a Mesopotamian campaign was now in the cards. And a rather more sinister campaign was growing this week in Anatolia. Last week, Armenians had begun to be deported from their homes. Now, on April 15th, the Armenian community formally appealed to the German ambassador in Istanbul for official German protection. This was denied by Berlin, who did not wish to offend the Ottoman government. Meanwhile, thousands of women, old men, and children began to be deported across the mountains southward to Cilicia and Syria. This week, on April 12th, there are widespread attacks and looting of Armenian villages in Bitlis and Erzurum. And on the 15th, Armenian refugees arrive in Van from the surrounding area, claiming that 80 villages in the province have been attacked and over 20,000 Armenians have been killed in the past 3 days. And that's where we stand. Bombs raining from the British and German skies, the Russians failing at the Usak Pass, the Ottomans losing in Mesopotamia but building up near their capital, and the Italians now considering turning from their former allies and joining the Entente. Hubris. During war, the belief that many of the leaders of this war had that they were infallible, that their decisions and actions were correct simply because they were their decisions and actions. It was not possible for them to be wrong, and if their actions proved disastrous for their nations or armies, then it was not their fault. No matter how much reality screamed at them that it was, time and again. Whether it was Conrad performing human sacrifice on a gargantuan scale, closing in on 1 million casualties in almost comical repeated attempts to rescue a fraction of that number of men. Whether it was Winston Churchill already parceling out lands in the Middle East because a great victory at Gallipoli was a foregone conclusion, since of course the Turks couldn't fight. Or whether it was Enver Pasha, whose guiding hand led Ottoman forces to complete destruction in the Caucasus during the winter, and who not only refused to shoulder any of the blame for his catastrophic defeat, but laid it at the feet of the convenient scapegoat, the Armenians. It was the same thing. A stupid belief in one's own infallibility, and it would inevitably lead down the same path. Millions of men dead for vanity. If you want to find out more about Conrad von Hotzendorf's hubris and the reason why the Ottoman army was seen as weak by Churchill, check out our episode from January 8th right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Walt Schnabel. Cheers, Walt. And if you want to find out more about supporting our show, check out our Patreon page. And if you like what you saw, please subscribe.